Hi, my name is Léda Davies, and I am a MFA Theatre Practice candidate here at the University of Alberta. And I'm also a theatre and circus artist. And today I'm joining you from the rehearsal hall at the Tim Centre for the Performing Arts, which is right next door to the second playing space, which is where I was supposed to be doing my thesis project, Fish at the Bottom of the Sea. Now, of course, as we're all very familiar, due to COVID-19 and all the social distancing protocols, I was not able to realize my thesis project. So instead today, I'm inviting you on a little bit of a backstage tour into the collaborative and creative motivations for the project, as well as a glimpse into our rehearsal process. Fish at the Bottom of the Sea was written by playwright, poet, movement practitioner, and social activist Nicole Schafenaker over 10 years ago. And then it was produced for the first time in 2008 by Elizabeth Hobbs, who is an MFA directing candidate here at the University of Alberta. The play itself deals with issues of death and grief. Here is a little clip from the playwright, Nicole, introducing herself and talking a little bit about when we were working on the text and how we were hoping to find ways that the text could fall away to a new form of writing.
My name is Nicole Schafenaker, and I'm the playwright of Fish at the Bottom of the Sea. I was compelled to write this play because I was trying to work out an answer for myself about what grief is, and what to do with these experiences that leave you feeling really gripped by a certain moment in time. I was also curious about how this sensation of being paralyzed in time could be translated into a dramatic moment on stage. For me, this play is about a descent into body memory. It's about finding a self-created ritual in order to accept loss. And it's about connecting with the ordinary things around you, like the streets of Edmonton, in order to use them to propel you forward into a different moment.
Now, this process for the project was a collaborative one, and each one of us was actually holding multiple roles within the rehearsal hall. By doing this, we were trying to de-hierarchize our process and queer our theatrical roles in order to develop the project from a place of unknowing. This is a little clip from Liz Hobbs, the director of the project, talking about holding those multiple roles in the collaboration, and also speaking to how we were aiming to allow the structure of the project to meet the content.
My name is Liz Hobbs, and I was the director on Fish at the Bottom of the Sea, working with Léda Davies and Nicole Schafenaker. My role as director on this project, because we didn't ever quite get into the rehearsal stage of it, was a bit different. In terms of, I mostly saw my role as feeding back on the creation process that was being made in the room and interpreting the physical work that I saw into narrative that would help inform the script that already existed or add to it in a new way, and basically just kind of being an eye in the room that was trying to constantly connect text with movement in terms of creating coherent storytelling. The content of Fish at the Bottom of the Sea deals with grief and trying to process and move on after the loss of a loved one. Grief is, by its nature, a very cyclical process where we return back to places that we've been before, and we can move through stages of grief, not in a linear order, but by constantly looping back and experiencing the same thing over and over again in slightly different ways. Nicole's writing structurally kind of mirrors that idea of grief and processing, in that it uses a lot of recurring imagery and ideas and themes that are revisited in a non-linear way. We jump back and forth between the present and the past and memory and a hopeful liminal space that does neither past nor present. And the structure of the play itself actually mirrors the content. So when we were trying to devise a way of working, we were trying to create a structure of creating that also mirrored the content, in that we were allowing things to inform and work out of order and feed off of impulse and instinct, rather than trying to approach everything from a linear psychological perspective.
Now, one of the people in the project who was also holding multiple roles was the performer in this project. I had the great fortune of working and finding someone in Alberta who was both an actor and a circus performer, and that was Samara von Rad. I needed to work with a circus performer on this project because I needed somebody who was going to be able to know how to keep themselves safe in the air, who would know how to warm up properly, to take care of their body. But I also needed an actor because I needed someone who was going to be able to know how to interpret the text, who was confident speaking text, and who would be able to have the ability to do those two things. Now, when I was working with Samara, I wasn't expecting her to know how to integrate the circus and theater together. So here's a little clip from Samara talking about what it was like to be in a production that integrated these two disciplines together.
Samara von Rad, and I was the actor-performer in Fish Under the Sea, Léda Davis's thesis project. I found having a foundation in both acting and aerials to be incredibly helpful in the rehearsal process. I think without having a foundation in aerial circus, I wouldn't have been able to explore on that apparatus. The bungees are incredibly stretchy and really fun to work on, but having a foundation of strength and technique, being able to explore was a lot more accessible to me in that process. And then also as an actor, being able to think about the text and what that would translate into on the apparatus. I think having that marriage of both made it possible to get to where we got to in the rehearsal process.
Now, one of my first and main inspirations for this project was an interdisciplinary one. As I mentioned, I'm a circus and theater performer, but before I ran away to join the circus, I actually started my training in theater and dance. And when I graduated from my undergraduate degree, I found myself torn between both of these disciplines, and I decided to make it my artistic mission to find ways to integrate text with movement. In that researching, that is when I stumbled upon different contemporary circus companies, such as Les Sept Doigts de les Mains, who I saw were actually fulfilling all of my desires as an artist, integrating this hyper-physicalized movement with storytelling. So I decided to turn a corner and dedicate my practice exclusively on circus. I moved to Montreal and I trained for 2 years only in circus. But what I found at the end of that was that I was really longing for all the things that I loved about theater. I wanted to embody a character and I wanted to speak some text on stage. So again, I was at this disciplinary crossroads between now theater and circus. When I began integrating these two things together, I realized that if I was really going to dismantle these disciplinary boundaries between circus and theater, I was going to need to broaden my vocabulary. And that's when I started using the term virtuosity. Now, virtuosity is a term that we've used for a long time in the English language. It originally came from the term to be virtuous, which means to be close to God. And then it was adapted by the Italians in music to mean the virtuoso, someone who was able to demonstrate an extraordinary skill. And this definition is really how we've begun to understand virtuosity. But in my research, I actually uncovered that there are many different types of definitions of virtuosity. And one of my favorite comes from Jonathan Burrows in his book, A Choreographer's Handbook. This is a little clip of that definition.
He raises the stakes to a place where the audience knows something may go wrong. They enjoy watching this negotiation with disaster. Will the performer fall or forget what they're doing, or will they get through it? The resulting anticipation, poised on the brink of success or failure, suspends time in a moment of in-breath. This slowed down time in the midst of risk is as much a pleasure for the performer as for the audience.
Now, in my process, I've distilled that definition and adopted it for myself. And instead I choose to frame it more as the audience's negotiation of a perceived disaster. And what I feel that this does is, as the audience is observing this negotiation, both them and the performer are launched into a hyper-present state. So I wanted to figure out how I could access this and recreate this in theater. And it became the foundation of our two questions when creating in Fish at the Bottom of the Sea. How do we embody or recreate this negotiation of a perceived disaster? And how do we access this heightened present state? Now, Fish at the Bottom of the Sea has two material points of inspiration. The first was the text, which I've spoken a little bit about. The other was an aerial circus apparatus. For Fish at the Bottom of the Sea, I was inspired by the performer Laurence Racine, who developed a piece that she calls bungee motion, and she uses an aerial bungee in this production. These are some stills from our rehearsal process and the aerial bungee that we ended up using in our creation process. Now, the aerial bungee is essentially a series of bungee loops attached to a single point. For our rehearsal and creation process, we made some adaptations to that. First, we decided to make 4 of the loops longer and 4 of them shorter. This allowed us to play with more height and levels within the production without having to rely on an aerial puller, who's someone who manipulates the apparatus and raises it up and down through a pulley system. These are some clips from our rehearsal process that show the different potentials for movement from this aerial apparatus. So as you can see, there is this vertical motion, but there's also a horizontal plane of motion that we're now able to play with, because the performer is able to attach themselves in the lower loops on the ground and move horizontally across the stage. We also added a swivel so that the performer could also spin in the air. Now, there were 2 things that the apparatus was able to uncover and exemplify in the text, and that was the notion of boundaries and resistance. With regards to boundaries, the play, as Nicole and I have mentioned, is about death and grief. And the boundaries that we were trying to recreate were the boundaries between life and death, this membrane, a threshold that once passed can never be returned to. In this way, the apparatus became somewhat of a teleological reference point, showing the difference between where Eve was, the protagonist, on Earth, and where her lost love was, somewhere unknown up above. The notion of boundaries was reflected in the script itself through imagery, such as water imagery, glass and windows. This is a clip from the text itself that exemplifies that water imagery.
I am light in the water, feeling the water around me, my body above and below the surface, and I realize that I am water surrounded by water, made of water, holding water, crying water, for the first time staying still, and that even if there is nothing beyond, there is something inside, fragile, breaking, and beating.
Now, what the bungee apparatus ended up doing was it exemplified, rather than being a metaphor or representing a character or a concept, an idea, it actually became a metonym, and it stood in for that invisible threshold. And it provided a container for Eve's grief, and it allowed the performer to then explore the resistance of that container in order to find acceptance. Which brings me to the next point of inspiration, which was resistance. Resistance is a reoccurring theme in my work and something I really enjoy exploring. I developed a course last year called Going to the Fear, Using Acrobatic Movement to Unlock Emotion. And the idea with the course was that I was teaching basic acrobatic movements such as handstands, somersaults, dive rolls, and using those as a container for resistance and a way to propel the performer into new emotional states. Fear, and the idea of fear actually was inspired by both my training in Pachenko Clown as well as the writing of Stephen Wang on grotesque technique in his book, An Acrobat for the Heart. In that book, he says, fear is, wait for it, fear is energy. Energy you can use to drive the work. Now, in the notion of feeling fear was foreign to me as a performer. I was always under the impression that if you were feeling fear, it was something to suppress, to hide as a performer. But at least in Pachenko Clown training, you're encouraged to acknowledge that fear and to lean into it. And what I found was that when I did that, I was able to not only connect to a deeper imaginative state and emotional life in myself, but I was also able to have a stronger connection with my audience. The idea of feeling is very counter to my training in circus. In fact, I would argue that as circus artists, we're trained not to feel. By feeling, you're in a way putting yourself at risk. So it would certainly only be something that you could do when you're stronger in the apparatus and more familiar with this type of work and training. I think this is for two reasons. One, because the aerial apparatus itself is actually quite painful, and if you were to lean into the feeling of that pain, I think it could become quite distracting. The other thing is that obviously it requires a great deal of concentration and cognitive awareness when you are in the air. So if you are opening yourself up to all the sensory receptors in the body, it can become overwhelming and you could destabilize yourself to the point of unsafety. So this is again why I was so fortunate to get to work with Samara on the project, because she already had this background and could keep herself safe in the air. Now, to return to that course really quickly, one of the exercises that we explored in this course was called the container exercise. In this exercise, participants imagine that they are in a container and they have to use their body to explore the edges of the container and to try and find an opening for the container. And when they do, then they find themselves in an even bigger container. And then the exercise continues until the performer is able to move freely throughout the room. But the participants in this movement laboratory actually found it really difficult to connect with the imaginary idea of a container. And so I began exploring physical ways that we could create this container for resistance. And that's when I started thinking about Therabands. In circus training, we use Therabands a lot to increase flexibility, to help with physical therapy, to build strength. So with the Theraband, we now had a physical container for resistance. And the body then is freed up to try and find solutions and new movement pathways to try and escape from that container. All the while in the exercise, connecting with the breath and how does this make me feel? The result is that there is a new emotional layer that is unlocked in the body when playing with resistance in this way. And it can be felt as a residue in the body as well. And that was what inspired me to use the elasticity of a bungee in this performance. But similarly, what we discovered when working on the bungee is that there was this residual effect when we got off of the equipment. So here's a little clip of Samara talking about that residual effect.
The residual effect of this apparatus on my body, I would say, is probably most accurately described as sea legs, similar to how people feel when they get off a boat after having been on it for a long time. I would feel almost like residual waves from having been suspended in this buoyant apparatus. There was just this feeling of being on solid ground. Didn't feel quite right immediately after getting off, and it would take some time to find my ground legs again.
If we were to have had the chance to move into the production phase of this project, I would have liked to have seen if that residual effect was also felt in the audience. Now, as you can see, my house of cards has collapsed, but that's okay, because this is about exploring failure, and all we have to do is build it again. Now, I am a very concrete person, and so I thought when I was embarking on this project that I was going to be developing a process for integrating circus into theater. This was going to be a repeatable system that I was then going to be able to apply to all different kinds of interdisciplinary scenarios. Well, that's not to say that this process isn't repeatable, but it wasn't about creating something concrete and stable. In fact, it was about finding different situations in which to destabilize the process so that both the performer and the creators could connect more with a felt sense and really truly integrate all these different elements together. Rather than thinking about this process of integration as a layering, I prefer to think of it like a fossilization. So in a layering, you have one thing lying on top of another. But in a fossilization, you have a body lying on top of an object, and over time, transforming that object completely. So in the case of Fish at the Bottom of the Sea, we had a body, and we had two objects. We had the text, and we had the aerial apparatus. And the body was laying on top of those things, but those things were also laying on top of the body, and over time, they were allowing themselves to be transformed. Our creation process was divided into 5 different stages. There was the generation phase, the dramaturgy phase, the scoring phase, and then rehearsal and production. Now, again, because of COVID-19, we weren't able to get to those final stages of scoring, rehearsal, or production. But I'd like to take this last half of the presentation to talk to you about those 2 parts, the generation phase and the dramaturgy phase. So with regards to generation, what we were trying to do was to simply place Samara, the performer, in different types of situations and to see what types of movement might unfold. What were the potentials of movement from the text and from the apparatus? We were just building a vocabulary. One of the ways we did this was by beginning our process with an authentic movement practice. Authentic movement is something that I've used a great deal in my work as a performer as a way to generate movement. Essentially, what it is it's an eyes closed practice where the mover attempts to connect with their proprioceptive sense. That's their unconscious movement. And there's also a witness, and the witness plays a very important role. The idea of the witness is that they are watching the mover and attempting to suspend judgment. I have found that over the course of time of practicing authentic movement, I've also developed an inner witness, and that person has become essential, especially when I've had to work on my own. So for Fish at the Bottom of the Sea, with the authentic movement practice that we were integrating, we actually decided to start the entire process with an authentic movement practice. We read the text together out loud, and then I asked Samara to close her eyes and embody the text and retell the story using her body and her proprioceptive movement. And then Liz, Nicole, and I sat on the outskirts of the room and observed her. After her practice, we relayed to her some of the gestures that we saw her perform, and she relayed them back to us. This is a little clip from Samara explaining what that was like doing an authentic movement practice.
Authentic movement exercises were difficult for me to get into at first. That wasn't how I have worked in the past. However, I will give Léda mad credit, because as we worked with that, she pulled some incredible things out of what my body was naturally doing and used it to create the choreography of what we then did in the air, of what we then did to interpret the text. And so coming through that, it felt like a really authentic expression of what my body looked like and what my body was capable of expressing. Instead of putting somebody else's choreography onto me, it was my own choreography that we had discovered through these authentic movement exercises that I did, in the end, find incredibly inspiring and helpful in finding interesting ways to express through movement emotion.
Later on in the process, I also tried to integrate principles from the authentic movement practice into our generation phase. So by doing that, I mean that I would ask Samara to move in the equipment on the ground with eyes closed and to connect with the felt sense of her body interacting with the equipment and the text. And in order to incorporate the text, I would pull different parts of the text and try and conjure different gestures from that. One of the parts of the text that I did that from is a section that I ended up calling I Offer You, where Eve lists a bunch of different body parts that she's offering to her lost love. This is a video clip of some of those explorations in our rehearsal process. Here, Samara is exploring with that I Offer You section and attempting to lead her body from those different body parts. And by leading her body, what I mean is she's trying to lean into the resistance of the equipment from those different body parts, be it her hand or her elbow or her collarbone. Now, apart from the authentic movement practice, I was also very much inspired by the choreographer Meg Stewart, and one of the principles she uses when creating her work, which is called the idea of an impossible task. Now, the impossible task basically engages the performer in mentally having to solve a problem. This impossible task that we uncovered actually was by accident, and it really did feel like an impossible task, and that was climbing the bungee. As I mentioned earlier, the apparatus had 4 longer bungees and 4 shorter bungees, but in order to access those bungees on top, the performer had to climb the bungee apparatus. But at first, at least, this felt absolutely impossible. Here is a clip of Samara trying to embody that impossible task of climbing the bungee. As you can see from this clip, Samara is in a situation that is providing her with a container for resistance. So now not only is the apparatus a container for resistance, but so is the situation that she is in. And the struggle to climb is allowing her to connect with a deeper felt sense. The idea of the impossible task by Meg Stewart comes from a broader notion that she talks about, which is states of being. In an interview in 1998 with, coincidentally enough, Jonathan Burroughs, who you will remember was the person who wrote that beautiful example of virtuosity, Meg Stewart says that rather than creating choreographic movement scores, she's more interested in creating states of being on stage. This idea of states of being got me thinking about states of matter, because as you will recall in the text, there is a great deal of water imagery, which exemplifies this notion of boundaries. So I wanted to see if there were ways that we could exemplify states of matter of water, that being solid, liquid, gas, and plasma. And in exploring this, I also started to think about the different stages of grief and how those represent different states of being. Coincidentally enough, as I was having this big brainstorming, Liz Hobbs was also in the process of researching stages of grief. This is a little clip of Liz talking about that beautiful synchronous moment in our creation process.
Came to a bit later in the process was the idea of thinking about the play through the lens of attributing different phases of grief in the 5 or 7 stages of grief to different sections of the text in order to kind of use it as a dramaturgical framing for what was happening for that character at different points throughout the play. I came up with this, and Léda came up with this, both of us, and we kind of just had the same idea, which seemed to be that it was a good idea. And then Léda took that one step further and then started thinking from a dance perspective, thinking about different states of being in terms of solid, liquid, gas, plasma, and what that means in terms of everything being jammed tightly together or more spread out and loose and floating, and what that physicality might mean in terms of understanding those stages of grief and thereby understanding some of the text. So trying to make those things work in concert with each other was one of the next steps that we were going to take on our dramaturgy that we didn't get to try out on our feet, but started being a very useful way of looking at understanding the text in a different way.
Now, after the generation phase, we began to enter into what we were calling our dramaturgy phase. And in this phase, we were really looking at ways that we could begin to integrate these two materials of text and movement. And one of the ways that we were looking at this was through a lens of abstraction. What I mean by that is we were wondering if there were ways that, in fact, we could abstract from the text and represent that moment using only movement, or if there was a way we could abstract from the movement and have that only be represented with the text. So this is a clip of Nicole explaining that notion of abstraction.
For me as a playwright, the process of abstraction was about finding a way to get underneath the words through movement, gesture, and image, and really try to understand the state that was being created by language. It was also about zeroing in on certain moments in time and exploring the dimensions and reverberations that live in the body and move in the body long after the actual moment has passed.
Now, although Nicole, when she wrote the play, she wasn't intending it to be a movement theater production, the writing had a way of provoking movement in the body. And perhaps this is because Nicole comes from this movement background. But there is a great deal of movement imagery in her writing. This is a little clip from the play that I feel evokes that sense.
The sky turning gray to gray to gray, I turn and close my eyes to find the empty space inside my body where my memory of you exists. I map out blank space in my body, imagining it complete and untouched, protected and warm. I hear a double heartbeat in my mind, and I think of you stored in the layers of my muscles and organs, folded away. I hold this space, this dark, open space, expanding bit by bit to fill my body.
Now, as a way to explore the integration of these two things, we relied on viewpoints exercises. Now, when I'm speaking about viewpoints, I'm not speaking about the originator of viewpoints, who is Mary Overly, but I'm talking about the system created by, of course, now I am blanking. Anyways, I will post a response in my notes later. I'm very much familiar with who wrote that, but Anne Bogart, haha, I knew it would come back to me. I just needed the cards to collapse first in order for that thought to come into mind. So Anne Bogart, in her book, the Viewpoints book, articulates these different exercises used specifically for this, for integrating movement into theater. So here is a clip from our rehearsal process where we were exploring with these viewpoints exercises. In this exploration, Samara is exploring the structure of a grid on the ground while also integrating gestures such as running, jumping, lying on the ground, and remains attached to the equipment the entire time. And then we would feed her different lines from the text that we felt evoked this sense of movement. All of these video clips can actually be found on our Instagram page. We used the camera kind of like a witness in our process to document our process, but also as a way to communicate to all the different performers. Now, one of the things that we uncovered while exploring with the viewpoints exercises was both Liz and I needed to find a way to communicate to one another what we were seeing unfold from this process. And we came across this phrase that we began using called "say what you see." This is Liz talking a little bit about that moment in our rehearsal process.
Rehearsal development, we discovered relatively early on that one of the most useful ways of learning from what we were doing was to go say what you see to the other creator in the room. And so that was a really great way of figuring out how to work together between Léda and myself, working with another performer, when both of us are approaching creation, but we're approaching it from a different perspective. So Léda is approaching it from a technical movement perspective, and I'm approaching it from a narrative-based perspective. And so the way that we found really useful to work together was for when she was creating with Samara, I would feed back what I saw being told from a narrative or emotional or story-based place. And then when I was working from a place of story or narrative, Léda would then feed back with what she saw in terms of technical movement and what she interpreted happening physically in response to a narrative or story-based prompt. And that started to be a really great way of understanding each other's work and how it could work together.
Now we are experiencing just a few technical difficulties, so please bear with me for this moment. And it actually gives me the opportunity to thank the amazing technician and genius on this project, Elijah, who has been helping me behind the scenes, make sure that this whole thing runs smoothly. There's so much about the streaming world that I knew nothing about, and he's been with me every step of the way, so I'm very grateful to him. And I'll just lull you with the sound of my voice. You also can't see this, but the House of Cards has collapsed once again. I really thought that we had a good one going there, but that's all right, we're gonna keep rebuilding. Now, after this dramaturgy phase, we were supposed to be heading into the scoring phase. And one of the things that we were hoping to accomplish with the scoring was to play with this idea of counterpoint. Counterpoint was a concept that I began to play with in a different production that I was involved in before I started my master's, actually, called Persephone Bound. Persephone Bound was somewhat similar to Fish at the Bottom of the Sea in the sense that it was a theater production that aimed to integrate an aerial apparatus, but in that particular project, the aerial apparatus were aerial straps. And the story of Persephone was based on the myth of Persephone, and it was a contemporary adaptation where Persephone found herself in her first year of college at a party off campus and was sexually assaulted. So it was looking at issues of consent in the production. Whoops. Now, the way I ended up defining that for myself is when the body does one thing, but the person says another. And it creates this beautiful visual paradox on stage and allows for a whole new level of understanding for the viewer of what's happening in terms of content and metaphor in the production. Now you can see my beautiful face and the amazing House of Cards. Now, In a few moments, I'm going to show you a clip of Persephone Bound. This was filmed at the production here at the University of Alberta that was done in September this year. In this particular clip, Persephone has just been sexually assaulted and is being interviewed by a third party, and she's having to defend why she didn't go to a third party sooner and why she didn't do more to try and stop the assault from happening in the first place. I will warn you just before we go to this clip that it does start off quite dark. Here we go.
I went limp. I thought if I passed out, he would leave. I hadn't actually passed out. Not like a game at all. I don't know how long. It felt like forever. He didn't. I said stop. I'm sure. I don't know how many times. Isn't once enough? I said stop. Not loud enough, I guess. I didn't scream. I was at a party. I was scared. I didn't want to get into trouble. I know I wasn't doing anything wrong.
Now, in that particular clip, you have Persephone balancing in the splits in the air. Her body is physicalizing her inner turmoil, how she feels torn between events of the past and where she is currently in present time. But she's vocalizing, the way she's delivering the text is very calm and collected. So we get a sense of this counterpoint. This was an idea that we were really hoping to begin to explore as we headed into the scoring part of this process, but again, unfortunately, we weren't able to get that far. But we do look forward to having the opportunity to explore the scoring and revisit all of those elements of the creation process again once theaters and circus spaces reopen. That brings me to the conclusion of this project. I was not able to build the house of cards, but I certainly learned a great deal in attempting this process, and I hope it exemplified for you the three main pillars of this project, which were collaboration, interdisciplinarity, and virtuosity. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope you all stay safe and stay healthy.